With the reopening of the English institution of the pub, at least for now, people may return to getting messed up with their mates and staggering home with a drinks coast and a traffic cone in hand, like the functional country that we are. But you may be wondering why it's fine to resume the sesh, but your big day, the wedding, the long-standing tradition of loved ones since before even the introduction of the simple gin and tonic to our isles, has to be cancelled or severely limited. I'm here to offer up a solution, 18th century style. Why not make use of the means you have available and find a dodgy clergyman who will wed you in the pub? Or a prison. I mean, if it's true love, then there's no need to be fussy. Marriage in the 18th century was, well, different to how we might imagine traditional marriage today. But before we get into that, we're going to have to take a look at a few key terms, some parliamentary acts, and cover some basics about the history of marriage since the medieval era. But I promise it's worth sticking around because some of these things couples were getting up to in the 18th century were truly chaotic. First thing to consider was that the way marriage was recorded before the turn of the 17th century wasn't very formalised. Marriage could be a personal act between the couple, with maybe a witness and maybe the involvement of a church figure. This is a bit different to what might be your idea of a medieval marriage. A very young bride going away to marry a crusty old man, exchanging her dowry for patriarchal protection. But this was really only the case for noble courtiers, where marriage was functioning as a means for political stability or power, or like an apprenticeship program for how to be a good king or queen. For the rest of society, marriage could be a lot looser in its definition and could easily be the product of an age-appropriate whirlwind romance. It could be very informal by our standards, with greater emphasis placed on the verbal contract, or two people saying to each other that they wanted to be married, and that alone was enough for them to indeed be married. By the 18th century though, some slightly more established practices have been developed for a marriage to be official and legal. First, the pair need to be over the age of consent, 14 for boys and 12 for girls. Second, they needed to make an agreement of marriage or a verbal contract, which could be done in two forms. Either in the present tense, as in we are now married, or in the future tense, once the marriage has been consummated, as in we will be married once we have done the deed. This verbal contract needed to be witnessed by two people. All other marriage ceremonies were illegal, but they were still binding. Illegal ceremonies are referred to as irregular or clandestine marriages. Now, time to cover a few parliamentary acts and changes to church practices. How exciting! First, we have the 1553 Ecclesiastical Licenses Act, which allowed couples to dispense with bans or a public announcement of a marriage by the church. This helped couples keep the match private if they wanted, but they had to pay for such a privilege. Second, from 1604, the church clarified how church weddings should be done between 8 AM and midday in the couple's local parish 3 weeks after bans had been met. This was to help church weddings be a little more regulated. Next, in 1694, stamp duty made marriage ceremonies more expensive with a new tax. This was, so they could have more tax. Finally, the 1753 Hardwicke's Marriage Act went much further than ever before to formally regulate marriages. We won't go into everything about this act, but the essentials are that this was when the pronunciation of man and wife became a formality, as well as that all marriages now needed to be recorded in the parish register and couples under 21 needed parental or guardian permission. And most importantly, only Anglican church weddings were binding and all other ceremonies were not. Phew, enough of that. Hope you were paying attention because there will be a quiz at the end. Weren't we promised something about getting married in a pub? Yes, we were. Now let's take a look at what marriages were like before the 1753 Hardwicke's Marriage Act. And let's see what tomfoolery people were getting up to in London. Welcome to Fleet Prison. In the 18th century, it is mostly inhabited by debtors. The prison is a for-profit fee-taking exercise and its fees are some of the highest around. Because how better to resolve someone's bankruptcy than charging them to have their leg irons removed? There is the confined, squalor, common side, and there is the more comfortable rent-paying, master side. It is possible to live in the vicinity of the prison, providing you're paying to cover the keeper's lost earnings and fees. The area around the prison is technically outside control of authorities and the church jurisdiction, and therefore it is subject to general lawlessness, referred to as the rules of the fleet. And these debtors and disgraced clergymen still needed to have a nice time, so there are a variety of pubs on offer. But the clergymen also needed to find a way out of their situation, so why not offer up their services for a small price? Meet a clergyman down a Fleet pub and they will provide you a clandestine marriage. There is a variety of entertainment and music on offer, plenty of food and drink, excellent venues, and as many guests as can fit around the table. On top of that, your dodgy clergymen will offer you their bespoke services. including backdating to cover up an illegitimate child, waiving of stamp duty, offering a marriage license to dispense bans, and turning a blind eye to the age of consent. A fleet marriage has some obvious benefits, like to cover up pregnancy, to avoid a lack of parental consent, to get around being underage, or to get married on a tight budget. But they were also generally popular because it was a fun environment and everyone could have a party. It's hard to get exact numbers, but it's thought over half of marriages in London in the first half of the 18th century were fleet marriages. There were also some, say, undercover benefits to a fleet marriage. Why have the fun of a fleet marriage once and then stop there? A woman in 1739, reportedly well-dressed, came to the sign of the Bull and Garter, next door to the Fleet prison, and was there married to a soldier. In the afternoon she came again, and would have been married to a butcher, but that parson who had married her in the morning refused to marry her again, which put her to the trouble of going a few doors and on further to another person who had no scruple. You know, I really feel for this lady having to deal with this parson and their lack of a loyalty programme. Are you finding the spark has gone out of your relationship? Are you eyeing up your best friend's spouse instead? Well, why not do what these two couples did in 1742, according to John Ashton? Two persons, one of Skinner Street and the other of Webb Square, Spitalfields, exchanged wives to whom they'd been married for upwards of 12 years. On the same day, to the content of all parties, marriages were consummated at the Fleet. Each husband gave his wife away to the other, and in the evening had entertainment together. Do you want to wed the lady of your dreams, but you're sick and tired of heteronormative society? Well, the Fleet has some good news for you. As long as you cough up and get out of there, it is a no questions asked policy, as this couple took advantage of in 1737. My clerk judged they were both women, and if the person by the name John Smith be a man, he's a little short, fair, thin man, not above 5 foot. After marriage I could almost prove you were both women, but the one dressed as a man, thin, pale-faced and wrinkled chin. The Fleet marriage gradually became more and more unruly, with people getting up to all sorts. And because there was a verbal contract, these agreements were all binding, until you decide to have a clandestine marriage with someone else. But all of this was brought to a grinding halt with the 1753 Hardwicke's Marriage Act, which we covered earlier. From this point, fleet marriages were no longer binding, and couples had to follow the official procedure. There are a few different scholarly viewpoints about whether Hardwicke's Marriage Act had a positive or negative impact on people. Eve Taver Bannett says it was a most cruel law for the fair sex. Her reason was the act was strictly upheld, leaving people vulnerable to having their marriage annulled if they did something slightly wrong. Alternatively, a woman could be seduced with a promise of marriage and then abandoned, vulnerable and pregnant. Rebecca Probert argues that the act either had no impact on people or that women actually benefited from it. Most people away from London and the Fleet were moving towards the formalised church marriage practice anyway, and the law was just an update according to what people were already doing. The increased recording and formalisation meant women had proof they were married and to whom, meaning they could compel their husband to cough up and help pay for their own child. In contrast to Bannett's argument, this seems to have become a real problem in the decades before the Act. And the 1750 legal case between Jane Shepherd and Edward Fuller may have been the moment that got Parliament to do something about the unofficial marriage practices going on. Jane Shepherd claimed their marriage had been consummated and verbally contracted away from the church. Edward Fuller claimed nothing of the sort had happened. Whatever happened between these two, they may not have been in this situation if this had happened after the Act had made such agreements non-binding. The main change after this Act was the end of the Fleet marriage. The law mostly intended to rein in the questionable marriage practices happening there. It wasn't very helpful to have people marrying multiple times a day or swapping partners. Unfortunately, this did make marriage more expensive and people were more limited in their choices around the ceremony. It also meant queer couples no longer had this option, but that didn't stop them seeking out other ways to wed. Now it's time for us to ask, what is the point of knowing all this? Personally, I like learning about this because I think it's hilarious. You could get married in the pub by a clergyman in prison for debt. It barely seems like something that actually happened, but if you read more about the 18th century London, you will realise, yes, this is exactly the type of crazy thing that would have happened. It's also an interesting history to learn in the sense that it's very different to the stiff, conformative marriages with unnerving power dynamics that we might imagine from the past. what we might consider to be a traditional wedding with a white dress and the vows and the father walking the bride down the aisle is actually a fairly recent social expectation. It shows that you can find queer histories where you just have to look away from conventional sources. It shows that people from the past also wanted to have a fun time when they got married, but they bent the rules and that marriage didn't have to be something restricted. Marriage was, and still is, just some people making a promise to each other.